welcome to the How Not to Screw Up Your Kids podcast, the bucket emptying episodes. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Han, psychologist and parenting expert. So, pour yourself a cuppa, find a comfy seat, and enjoy the conversation. Today's bucket emptying episode is for your children, and I'm setting you a bit of a challenge and a bit of a mindset shift to help your children take those plunges and not see mistakes or failures as catastrophic. So the challenge that I'm setting you is about reframing mistakes and failure. And instead of seeing them as I remember reading a post that talked about failure is not a full stop, it's a comma. Let me explain what that means. It's that we often view, and particularly children, I try something, I have therefore failed, I am a failure. And that's the end of, hence the full stop. Whereas if we see failure or setbacks, whatever word we use, instead as a comma, it's part of a process. It's part of that learning. And so what I would encourage you to play around with and experiment is using an analogy and a framework for your children that sees them really very much as scientists, running a series of experiments to see what might happen if. And the reason why that framing changes how they view setbacks is if I'm a scientist and I'm experimenting, maybe I'm experimenting different flavors of hot chocolate. Maybe I'm experimenting different flavors to put on popcorn. Well, the idea is when I view things from that experimental scientific approach, there's no failure, is there, to the different flavors that I might put on popcorn or the different flavors that I might try with hot chocolate. They'll either be, oh, I like that, that's nice, or I don't like it, or I like bits of that. I wonder if I might also. So that's really what we're trying to do, is rather than see things as I try this and it's either a success or a failure, it is, I've tried this is what came out from it. It was interesting, and I would refine and tweak and change it in this way. So if we can begin to have that narrative and encourage our children and even our teens to view it this way, we can then create this environment where trying something isn't seen as risky, because it's a process of seeing it as I have a go, I experiment, I try, and I learn from that. So how do we instill that? So let's say you're listening to this and thinking, oh, I like this idea of the scientist Mary Han, but I've got an 8-year-old that is basically not going to try it, or I've got a 13-year-old. So of course, try and avoid, the first thing is let's avoid lecturing our children, because that's often the way that they switch off. And so if you're loving this idea, it doesn't necessarily mean that going straight into explaining it to your children or your teen that they're instantly going to say, oh, what a great idea, I'm about to change the way that I think. Instead, what we want to do is start looking at how we model. So it's really important. Children are much more likely to do what they see than what we say. So how can we demonstrate a mindset and an approach that sees us experimenting and trying things from that perspective? Because if we're beginning to do that and model that, then our children and teens will pick up on that. So first thing is, what can you do that may well begin that process? So have a consider around something that you might already be currently working on that you can begin to vocalize much more to your children and let them know. Maybe you're experimenting with a recipe. Maybe you're experimenting with a side hustle to your job. Maybe you're experimenting with a routine. Maybe you're experimenting with some exercise. Whatever that might be, have that conversation with your children, not in a sit down and I'm going to tell you about what I'm doing, but much more as part of a natural conversation that happens at meal times when you're talking about things, or as part of your catch up on a Sunday. Is one of the goals that I'm setting myself this coming week is I'm having a bit of a play around. I fancy the idea of running regularly, and I'm going to try I'm going to experiment with when's the best time for me to run and how long. So I'm making a commitment to all of you is that on Wednesday I'm going to try this, and on Friday I'm going to try that. So really starting with that. So that's the first thing, because what's happening then is your children are picking up some of the language and that framing in that way. The next way that you can do it is when your child next comes to you with a problem or a particular challenge or situation that they're dealing with, and they're asking you for a solution. Or maybe they're not asking you for a solution, but they're simply sharing that particular problem or challenge with you. What we can then do is use a different narrative. I wonder what you could experiment with and what you might try. Because we don't really know what the best answer or the best approach to this is, but I wonder what options are available. What do you think those are? What options do you have available to you to tackle that particular challenge or to deal with that particular situation? For example, let's say your child comes home and talks about a particular challenge they're having with friendships at school. And maybe they feel excluded. Maybe they feel that they're not in the popular group. Maybe they've had an argument with a friend. So we're going to do our usual acknowledgement, potentially trying to label the emotion for them. And then we're going to go into our natural, normal coaching rather than fixing. And what we can then do as part of that coaching is approach it from that perspective of, I wonder what you could experiment with, what you might try first. What are the options do you think that you've got? What could you do next time that friend is that particular way, or when you go into school tomorrow when you're trying to interact with these friends? So really framing it from that science, because you're then giving the narrative of, we don't really know what might happen, but what seems a good idea to try first and experiment with and see what the outcome is. So we've set that up already for it to be a bit of an experiment. And then what we need to make sure that we do is we follow up on that, because that's what a scientist does. They put an experiment in place, they observe the results, they reflect on the results, they make a plan to modify the next experiment. So we can begin to kind of integrate that in terms of how we help and support our children, and then making sure that they then do the feedback loop themselves and reflect on, did you use that? Which of the different experiments that we talked about, your different options, which one did you use? What happened? What might you do differently next time? Keep me in the loop. So we get them to try and experiment that. And that's a really great way, because we're detaching from the outcome and we're much more focused on the process. So the last thing that we do is we make sure that we praise descriptively. So I'm so impressed with the way that you handled that situation because you did X, Y, and Z. Praise what we see that we want to see more of. So praise that descriptively, and making sure that we praise the process. We're not interested in the outcome. We're interested in praising the fact that you tried, the fact that you took one of the experimental hypotheses and you put it into place, and what have you learned from that? So using lots of language around learning from the process rather than the outcome itself. So I hope you find that useful, because it's so crucial that our children don't see failure or setbacks or mistakes as a full stop, but simply the beginning of that learning journey. As ever, if you have enjoyed this podcast episode, I would be eternally grateful if you could share it with friends, colleagues, neighbours, and forums that you are part of, so that others can find us and we can spread the love. So until next time.